Hey everyone, it's the Procrastinating Professor here, and today I'm going to be talking about using acrylic washes, using some of my models as examples of how you can use these washes in slightly different ways. Now, chances are, if you're familiar with miniature painting, the washes that you've handled so far, like the GW ones, are acrylics. You can also use enamels and oils for washing and shading, but I'll talk about those in the future video. Although I've already shown enamel washes being used for my Annihilator from Beltec in my Painting Yellow tutorial, and I've also shown oil washes being used in my World War II Late War German tutorial that I already have on this channel. Alright, so we're going to be talking about 3 different methods. The names I've given for these different methods or these techniques are things I've just come up with to roughly approximate what you're actually doing, right? So we're going to start by talking about the full cover method. Now, chances are the full cover method is the one that everyone starts with. It's the one that when you talk about wash, it's what people typically do, right? You just take your ball of wash, slam it on the table, dip your brush in it, and just cover your model in the wash, right? It's something that some people frown on, right? But here's the thing. There are some users, although you have to take some precaution. The biggest precaution is don't use too much wash, right? So like just now you saw I put quite a lot of wash on my models. I do use that much actually when I do full cover, but I always make sure that I shift the paint around with my brush a little bit to avoid pooling. I'll show an example of pooling and what happens after it dries because it's pretty ugly. But just make sure that you use just enough to shade the recesses and not any more. So what are the pros and cons of this technique? Well, it's something that everyone's familiar with. Very little effort, frankly very little skill. It's great for beginners and it's very fast. It kind of gives instant contrast, but it is extremely messy, right? And it will tint the entire area. So if, for example, if you use Acrylics, everything's going to be a little bit more brown. If you use Noun oil, for example, a black wash, it's going to be a little bit more black. So it's something that you want to be very careful about. Now, when do you use these? There are quite a lot of different ways of using them and different times to use them. But for example, if you have highly textured surfaces, you may want to consider using it. If you have metallics, it's one of the ways that people tend to use. And of course, if you want to just make dirty hots, for example, orcs and whatnot, typically creatures that are not known for their cleanliness or bright coloration, then you can of course use washes as well. But there are of course a lot of different ways to use it, and again, this is just kind of a very brief tutorial showing some different results if you were to use this technique. So let me show some examples using my own models. So for example, this dwarf was painted using this method. I basically just painted the silver on using a zenithal highlighting using darker to brighter silvers, and then I essentially washed the entire model in Acrylic Earthshade after, of course, painting the gold, and then I re-highlighted it back up to the brightness that you currently see on screen. Now, if you want to use it for dirty hots, you can also do that as well. This is an orc. It's a Mordor orc from the Middle-earth strategy battle game line by GW. And in this case, of course, I wanted them to look, well, dirty and earthy. So again, I painted all of the base colors, and then I just covered the entire model in, again, in this case, Acrylic Earthshade, and then I re-highlighted it to give it this look. Now, if you want something that's a little bit more refined using this technique, I actually painted this entire model, and then I actually covered the entire thing in, well, again, Acrylic Earthshade, and I also used some Drakenhof Nightshade in the bluish parts, and then I slowly touched up and built up the highlights and the brighter colors again, and as a result, that's why the color looks a little bit more vibrant. It's not as dirty as the previous example that I've shown. Now, one thing to keep in mind again when using this technique is that you have to avoid pooling. You can see an example of pooling down here at the bottom of the Orc's shield, where you can see the dark splotch. Now in this case, of course, for me personally, I was like, it's probably leather or something anyway. It's an orc, it's fine. But I of course know that that's definitely a result of pooling. And if you were painting for some sort of display level thing, well, just don't do it, right? You have very little control. That's why I said just now, this technique is messy, so be mindful of it, alright? So let's take a look at the next method. The next one is what I call targeted. Now, chances are if you're looking to improve your painting, if you want your painting to go from being a little bit messy to a little bit tidy, then chances are you are going to be using this technique. Essentially, you take a little bit of your wash and then you paint it in the recesses, almost like you're doing lines or just painting the shadow on. So for example, down here I have my Imperial Fist, and again I'm using Acrylic Earthshade. But you'll notice I'm not covering the entire model, right? I am only painting where I want the Acrylic Earthshade to be. I'm not touching anything else, because in this case, if I covered the yellow in Acrylic Earthshade, it will get very dirty. And I don't want that. I want my yellow to look yellow. I don't want my yellow to look brown at the end of the day. So, using this technique, of course, the biggest pro is that it's extremely tidy. If you take the trouble to actually put your washes where they should be, it will improve the general attractiveness of many models. Now, the cons, of course, is the fact that, as you can imagine, it's extremely tedious. If you have a lot of details to paint, God help you, if you have a lot of rivets to paint, then you're going to be taking a while. It's going to take some time. And of course, you're going to ideally want, well, not say that you need to have steady hands, but the thing is that if the hands shake quite a bit, which happens to all of us, then you're going to have to do a bit of cleanup. So this is the kind of thing that you do when you just want the wash for the shade and you want to actually keep your model clean, as I've mentioned just now. And it's something that ultimately you kind of want to master, right? Because the technique will dramatically, as I said just now, improve the quality of your paint jobs. So for example, looking at this steam tank, now it's mostly metallic, and you would be inclined to think that, oh, maybe I should just drown the entire model in Acrylic Earthshade. But if you look carefully in this case, I actually did not do that, right? For all of the metallics, all of the silver, and parts of the gold, I actually did not cover them in Acrylic Earthshade, because if I did, it would make the entire model a little bit more brown. As you can see down here, I'm very slowly pointing out, you can pay attention to, for example, these rivets, right? You'll notice that I actually took the time to paint around every single rivet. I've also taken the time to paint around all the gold, because again, if I just wash the entire area, the silver around the gold will also turn brown, and I didn't want that. So I applied it gently. Now, however, for the top, you look at the wood grain, right? For the wood grain, I did cover the entire wood grain in Acrylic Earthshade. So you can see that even on the same model, I'm combining both techniques of being targeted as well as, of course, putting in the washes where I want them to be. So looking at another example here, I have a Space Wolf on a Thunderwolf mount. And if you look at the rider itself, I've used the targeted approach to shade the recesses. I made sure not to cover the Space Wolf grey or the baby blue color in the Acrylics, because it would have painted the entire surface. It would have tinted and tainted the entire surface in a ruddy brown color, which I did not want. However, for the wolf itself, I actually did use washes and use full cover, because I'm going to call this kind of a third technique, where you kind of combine both the full cover and targeted approach, because you're trying to modulate or differentiate the area a little bit. So I'm going to show this model again. This time I want you to pay attention to the wolf. And you'll notice that actually, by right, if you pay close attention to its fur, you'll notice that there are, of course, slightly different colorations. And this was accomplished by using a combination of sepia, brown, well, Acrylic Earthshade, black, non-oil basically, and even some blue, Drakenhof Nightshade, I believe. And of course, I did repaint the highlights and whatnot, and we'll talk about highlighting in a future video. But that's kind of how I use different washes at different times in different layers to kind of accomplish this different look. Now, another example that I do want to show would be my Sauron. I apologize, it's a little bit dusty. I just noticed that after recording it. But anyway, for my Sauron, if you look at the model very closely, if you look at the armor very closely, ignoring the dust that's on it, you'll notice that there are some parts where the metal seems to be a bit shaded in brown, but you also notice that some parts of the metal are shaded a little bit in green, and some of it a little bit in purple as well. As I move the model around, you can see that the metal doesn't exactly reflect or have the exact same hue all across, because I did again use different washes to kind of intentionally paint certain areas differently. So for example, although much of the body would be used with Agrax, I didn't heavily wash it, keep it in mind, but I did use quite a bit of Agrax here and there. I also did combine some green, a Tonian camel shade I believe, in some areas where I kind of wanted it to look a little bit oily and dirty, and I used, for example, purples and blacks for the shadows, so it kind of gave it this kind of modulated kind of look. And of course, then I re-highlighted the metallics. So that's it. That is basically the end of today's video. I hope that it's been helpful to all of you. If it has, then please do consider subscribing, as well as supporting the Ko-fi membership and checking out my other social media accounts. So that's all. Thank you and take care.